Hey guys, for today's Coaches Roundtable, we're posing the question, what happens when our joints are snap, crackle, and popping during movement? Whether we're deadlifting, squatting, pushing, pulling, does that mean, or what does it mean exactly? Sean?
So one of the things we want to get curious about is, when a joint is making sound, I think the first question is this bad or is this normal? And there's a few different reasons why a joint might make sound, and there's different answers based on why that joint is making the sound that it's making. Kind of the first and most common reason why a joint would make sound is what would be called a crepitus or a cavitation. This is like if you crack your knuckle and it cracks one time and it doesn't continue after that. That is what we would consider normal joint sounds. That's part of just basic movement. This is, you do that first push up and you just hear the elbows crack and they don't continue after that. It's just part of getting a joint warmed up and starting to move again. I think the more interesting question is what happens when it persists or it happens consistently through repetition. I think the most common one is like the creaky knees, right? And so with weightlifters, people who are on kind of consistent squatting programs, Olympic lifting programs, especially very upright, dominant programs where there tends to be a lot of demand and load through the knees, if you start hearing a lot of joint sounds, you want to maybe relate this back to the way that person is moving and seeing is this kind of the leading indicator of a load order sequencing problem.
So what I'm hearing you say is it seems like it can be a overloading of the knee or perhaps...
It can be a sign of an early load or maybe an uneven load. So maybe the knee joint is taking a higher load. The hip joint loves to be loaded, but it's a lazy joint. You have to do a lot of technique and stay focused and consistent to load the hip joint, especially those more upright variations. There can be kind of a leakage that turns into more loading through the knee than is optimal.
In your clinical experience, do you find that there's a differentiation between if we tie this back to the squat, like literally sometimes there's like a creaking motion or a creaking sound versus like a click, 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 click,
click.
Click.
So that kind of creaky hinge is exactly what it sounds like. That means usually you're hearing strain in the actual joint tissues. So you might be hearing like a kneecap or patellofemoral joint actually physically compressing and sliding over the other half of the joint. And you generally hear this more in older lifters who might have some degeneration happening. And sometimes this is completely painless and sometimes it's painful. When it's painful, then obviously that's a sign of something going wrong and we want to kind of stop and unload and maybe go through the process of treating this almost like an injury, or at least trying to make sure it doesn't progress all the way through to an injury. When it's not painful, I think that's the more complicated question. It's kind of clear if it hurts, like, let's stop. If it doesn't hurt, it's like, is that bad? Is that normal? Is that just the way my knee works? Because, if you do have some degeneration in your joint, on one hand, it's not coming back. Like if you start to wear your cartilage down, that cartilage is generally not going to restore itself. The best thing you can do is stay strong. Make sure you're under load. So it wouldn't be the smartest thing to do to say, oh, I heard a joint sound once, so now I don't squat anymore. It's like a little bit of an overreaction to something that is not even truly a big problem. But we want to see, does that give us some information about technique? So I tend to see people who have loud knees or knees that either crack and snap or creak, that tends to be a sign of early knee bending. So you want to kind of slow things down. Maybe you do like a video assessment and see, is that person shifting their weight forward and losing good pressure through the back of their foot? Is this person bending their knee earlier in the movement than is optimal? And can we adjust or alter that foot pressure and up the chain, kind of get a little more bias? If they kind of shift forward, can we just kind of let that pendulum shift back a little bit?
Right. So if we remove a little bit of load and give some slack to the joint, it allows the tissues to basically perform its function without the extra noise it's making.
Right. In my practice and the way that I teach this, it's not a bad thing. And if someone can't work around this, I'll say, all other things being equal, I'd rather have you load as long as it's not painful. But if we can alter your technique and have it get quiet, that's kind of that internal feedback. And then that person may feel, oh, I was able to actually get more of my posterior chain involved in that set or that rep. So that may be a better performance indicator. And now we can use that as a performance indicator. We can kind of develop that athlete's internal awareness of their own body and say like, okay, an indicator that I am leaking power and I'm overusing the anterior chain and not getting enough posterior chain is this joint sound. Because I do think, that is a sign of friction at some degree, and enough friction starts to light a fire. So we do want to make sure we're not allowing this to go indefinitely. Just say, well, it doesn't matter if your joints make sound, because that's not a good thing. It just doesn't necessarily mean I would hold them up. It's not serious enough to say you can't squat.
So something that's adjacent to that then in terms of just joints making noise is the rolling like tendon or tissue over the bone.
Right.
How would you address that?
So this is a great question too. A lot of times we'll see this happen when an athlete's really stiff, right? Again, kind of sticking with that knee example, if you have extremely stiff quads, that spring isn't stretching as much, which means you're going to transmit more load into the joint because the quad won't lengthen and absorb some of that force. So that's going to actually put more tension through that system, increase the compression on the patellofemoral joint, for example. And sometimes we see that problem, you hear the joint and then, a few training sessions later or a few months later, you actually feel the pain would be more up in the muscle if that is an over tension problem through the anterior chain. Because if you're overloading the front side of the system, the muscle that's going to get overloaded is the quad, for example. So doing some down regulation and some soft tissue work, just basic couch stretch with quad smash on the quad, that could be the simple way of kind of restoring some of the native flexibility through that. I talked initially, maybe we manage this more with the technique side of things, but you do want to also assess the mobility side of things, because this could also be a sign of a person who is missing their shapes and is having to push too far or put too much load in the joint because they're compensating for a stiff part of that musculoskeletal system.
So from your clinical viewpoint, let's say athletes that enjoy, surplusing with equipment like knee sleeves, elbow sleeves, wrist wraps. Typically my go-to answer for athletes that want to address the question of equipment is I'm like, equip late, because once you start equipping, we adapt and we end up using it as a safety net, and it's hard for us to like unequip ourselves.
Totally.
What is your take on sleeves and wraps and that of the sort?
I think I'm fine with anyone using anything that makes them comfortable. From a knee sleeve standpoint, I know some people feel like it gives them some stability, or if you're using a very thick knee sleeve, it might give you a little bounce. I tend to see that as a way of making the joint hot. And, especially as you get into your master's category lifters, just having a hotter joint is a beneficial thing. Like, that is a really important aspect. If the joint is cold, it's not going to feel like it moves smoothly. Additionally, some of that compression around the joint gives you some proprioceptive input. And so if you're doing a sport like Olympic lifting, where that input around your knee joint, like that motor input from your body, that might really help that person make that split-second adjustment to technique or position, because they get a little more information because their skin is being compressed in addition to their normal kind of awareness of where their body is in space. So It's kind of like taking your dials and just dialing up the awareness of your knee position just a little bit
Right.
more.
So the compression's giving the system more feedback,
Yeah,
right? So
totally.
you have higher concentration and awareness in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And then also sounds like the knee sleeves, what you're a fan of is the heat aspects, maybe warming up the synovial fluid, getting the viscosity level turned up so that there's
and
just more motion.
Just more motion. It's a way of kind of saying like, this is a part of the system that needs a little extra. Let's put a little extra there. So yeah, I think that's a thing you could try with someone who has kind of the creaky, cranky knee, but it's not really big enough issue. That's a nice way of just allowing that person to feel cared for and safe enough to just do their training. If you're, a younger lifter and you're going to this very early in your training process, just a matter of months in, I think that might be, using your ACE card up your sleeve like way too early in your training lifespan.
Agreed.
And we've all seen that lifter who's got, a full kit bag and nothing to back it up. So, you want to make sure you're waiting to do that until it's the right time.
Wait, that was me when I started CrossFit. I was a week in, I had all the gear.
Hey, if you can't accessorize, why do it?
Totally agree. Okay, so if you had to do a quick wrap up, in terms of joint sound and noise, when do we continue to move athletes through their training, and when do we start to pull them back and kind of maybe re-examine other possible causes of what's going on?
Yeah, the only case with this where I'll stop is if that's associated with pain. If you move a joint, crack, ow, then that's a sign that we probably want to not load that joint more, at least until we figure out why and go through an assessment process and figure out what is causing that pain. The vast majority of the time, that is going to not be painful. And so what I would just say is, use that as an opportunity to get a little curious about how that athlete is loading, what their technique is, what their position is. And, if we can figure out little adjustments to technique, position, flexibility that allow that athlete to train quiet, then that's better. But otherwise, I would say, you don't stop because of that. It's just a sign that that person may have some work to do, as part of their long-term maintenance, so they get to keep doing this for the long game.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, Sean. I certainly learned so much talking to you in our conversations, and that wraps us up today for today's Coaches Roundtable.